single black feather, a silent church, and a sudden death. What really happened that morning? Welcome to Echo Files. I am your host, Walter Finch. Share where you're joining from. Your voices keep this mystery alive. Let's begin. The bells of St. Mildred's had just begun their gentle tolling, their sound carrying over the dew-slick hedgerows and into the tidy heart of Little Bramble, when the first parishioners arrived for Sunday morning Mass. The village, wrapped in the faint mist of early autumn, seemed half asleep, its narrow lanes deserted save for the occasional bicycle wobbling past or a cart rattling over the cobblestones. The churchyard yews stood solemn, their black-green boughs brushing the old gravestones, as though bowing in respect to the centuries of silent company beneath. Miss Marple arrived, as she always did. Precisely 12 minutes before the service, her small, neat figure wrapped in a soft dove-gray coat. She paused by the lich gate, her sharp eyes scanning the grounds, not searching for anything in particular, or so it appeared, yet noting everything. The arrangement of fallen leaves on the path, the odd angle of the sexton's broom leaning against the wall, and on the lowest step leading into the nave, a single black feather, sleek and glossy as if freshly dropped. She bent to pick it up, turning it delicately between gloved fingers, before tucking it away in her handkerchief pocket. Inside, the nave glowed with the muted colors of stained glass, the scent of candle wax mingling with damp stone. Familiar faces filled the pews. Mrs. Little, her bonnet trembling as she fussed with her prayer book. The Blakely brothers, straight-backed and unusually quiet. Young Ivy Barlow, casting nervous glances toward the aisle. It was a picture of rural calm, or so anyone might think. Reverend Pottle began the opening prayer. All bowed their heads. The stillness was almost absolute, broken only by the rustle of pages and the faint drip of water somewhere near the vestry. But when the first hymn ended, a faint murmur rose from the rear pew, followed by a strangled cry. It was Mrs. Rudd, the baker's wife, standing rigid, her face drained of color. Beside her slumped a man, Mr. Archibald Sims, the visiting organ tuner, his head tilted unnaturally, his eyes half-lidded. The hymn books he had been holding lay scattered at his feet, one open as if to a page never meant for him. The Reverend faltered mid-sentence. The organ's drone ceased in a wavering sigh. The congregation swarmed in alarm, all the decorum of worship dissolving into whispers and exclamations. "A faint," someone insisted. "A heart attack," muttered another. The doctor was summoned, though Dr. Penrose's pinched face, upon kneeling beside the man, said otherwise. Miss Marple, seated 2 rows ahead, did not join the crowding. She merely watched, her knitting needles unmoving in her lap. The black feather in her pocket seemed somehow heavier now. Within minutes, the dreadful truth was quietly confirmed. Mr. Sims was dead. The police would be called, of course, but in the meantime, speculation bloomed like wildflowers after rain. Why here, of all places? Why him? And, as Mrs. Little whispered a little too loudly, what on earth was that curious mark on his neck? Miss Marple, still in her place, observed the shifting glances, the subtle movements. The way Ivy Barlow gripped the pew rail until her knuckles whitened. The tight-lipped exchange between the Blakely brothers. The Reverend's sudden interest in straightening the altar cloth. To anyone else, these were simply reactions to a shock. To Miss Marple, they were the first threads of a very tangled skein. And in the stillness that followed the removal of the body, she found herself thinking, not for the first time, that a village church on a Sunday morning was as revealing a stage for human nature as any theater in London. The removal of Mr. Sims's body did not silence Little Bramble. It merely pushed the noise outdoors. By the time the wicker-borne stretcher had left the porch and the reverend had dismissed the congregation with a halting blessing, the churchyard had become a small marketplace of conjecture. Men stood in tight clusters, tapping their pipes and murmuring about weak hearts and modern diets, while the women's voices wove a higher thread through hedgerow and lychgate. Words were exchanged the way eggs were bartered in lean winters, something to be traded, something to be prized, and never quite what one had started with. Miss Marple took the narrow path toward the gate, unhurried, her expression almost apologetically mild, as if she were ashamed of noticing as much as she did. She paused to let Mrs. Little pass, who was leaning on her nephew's arm and whispering about the mark on the dead man's neck. Mrs. Little, who always prided herself on seeing things, had not seen the feather, of course. Miss Marple felt that small weight against her coat and, quite without intending to, thought of a hat she'd once repaired in St. Mary Mead, black egret fringe that looked splendid in lamplight, yet had an awkward habit of molting when one was jostled. She tucked the thought away, as one might tuck a pin back into its velvet cushion. At the gate, the sexton, Joel Noakes, stood with his broom like a sentry with a pike. He looked pallid and aggrieved, as if the corpse had personally insulted his paving stones. "Dreadful business," he muttered to anyone who would hear. "In God's house, too." Miss Marple's eyes slipped past the broom to the faint smear on the lowest step, where Mr. Simms's heel had dragged. There was, too, an almost invisible scuff farther right, as if someone had turned quickly in that narrow space. Small matters both, yet the smallest matters are sometimes the only honest ones. In the lane beyond, Ivy Barlow hurried along with her shawl clutched at her throat, as if the October air had suddenly grown sharp. She was normally a cheerful creature who took the world's blows with a shrug, but now her mouth was fixed as if in an effort not to speak. One of the Blakely brothers, George the elder, with a stiff jaw and stubborn shoulders, walked beside her, not quite protectively and not quite accusingly. Miss Marple's eye noted the precise distance between them. Several paces, as though an invisible string connected them, but someone had tugged it taut. The village constable, Sergeant Cray, came puffing up the hill from his cottage, his tunic a shade too snug and his cap slightly askew. He had been cutting wood when the boy came running. A fragment of sawdust clung to his boot and worried him more than the corpse, which he could at least file a form about. He made an effort to corral the leading gossipers and took down names with a pencil that needed constant licking. "You saw him fall?" he asked Mrs. Rudd. "No, he went all slumpy-like, and then there was that—" She flapped her hand helplessly. "That mark," supplied Mrs. Little from over a hedge, as if the hedge were a legal barrier and she a qualified witness. "Purple, under the ear. I saw it clear as the sermon was dull." "We'll have the doctor's word on what marks were where," Cray said, not entirely unpleased with his own official tone. "Until then, no one is to go back inside the church. Reverend Pottle, you'll keep things as they were, if you please." The Reverend, who had never felt less in charge of his own parish or his own nerves, nodded and then remembered to look more pastoral. "Of course, Sergeant, of course. We shall keep the, sanctity of the scene intact." He said the word sanctity as though it were a fragile glass he had nearly dropped. Miss Marple did not go home just yet. She drifted instead to the low stone wall bordering the path, where an elderly thrush hopped and pecked with professional single-mindedness. People came near her because one always did. She was a sort of conversational hearth where one could warm one's opinions without seeming to impose them. And so it was that she learned, without appearing to ask, that Mr. Sims had arrived the previous afternoon on the lorry that brought feed to Northfield Farm, that he had taken a room at Mrs. Platt's, the small house behind the ironmongery, that he had supped on cold tongue and pickles and asked no impertinent questions, and that this morning he had arrived early and gone straight to the vestry to examine the stops and pedals with reverent attention, for he was said to be devout about instruments, if not about sermons. She learned, too, that Ivy Barlow had been seen helping place hymnals at the rear shortly before the service, that George Blakely had carried a crate of candlesticks in from the porch because the Reverend had asked, and because George always did as asked when there were eyes on him, that his brother, Edwin, had been late, as was his habit when small economies could be made by saving his own footsteps, and she learned finally that Joel Noakes had scolded a flock of children for racing between headstones and had then gone to the bell tower to see about a frayed rope that had come to his attention, frayed ropes being a personal affront to him. All this drifted to Miss Marple as thistledown drifts, and she caught it with the same patience one uses in gathering what is liable to blow away. Dr. Penrose, cool and gray as the morning, returned from the surgery with a black bag and the crispness of professional habit about him. He spoke briefly to Sergeant Cray, who attempted to arrange his features somewhere between deference and comprehension. "You'll want the county inspector, I suppose," the doctor said in his dry way. "I can't say anything conclusive until after a proper examination, but I don't fancy a natural cause. There is a contusion consistent with a sharp grip or pressure beneath the jawline. The conjunctiva show petechial. Never mind that, Sergeant. Just say there are signs of asphyxia. The time of death will not be much before the first hymn." "Strangled?" breathed someone from behind the yews. "Smothered," whispered someone else. "Let's keep our guesses tidy," Dr. Penrose said, with a glance that swept the shrubs as efficiently as any broom. "The point is that he did not die because the Lord called him home at that exact moment." "We'll wire Melchester," Cray said, flustered by the turn to Latin-sounding words. "Inspector Mayhew will want the facts." "He will," Miss Marple murmured, so quietly that no one thought to include her in the conversation they were already having with her. And facts are funny creatures. They stand quite still until one looks at them as if they were something else. Dr. Penrose turned to her with a half-smile. He had long since stopped underestimating Miss Marple, which was a great saving in time and temper. "You were near the back, I think?" he asked. "2 rows ahead," Miss Marple said. "I heard the hymn finish, and then Mrs. Rudd gave a little cry as if she had dropped a dish." "Did you notice Mr. Sims before that?" "Only that he was very careful with his hymn books," Miss Marple said. "One sees carefulness. It is a kind of neatness that is not to do with tidiness, but with conscience. I fancy he felt he must arrange them just so." Said Dr. Penrose, which in him meant a polite thank you. The Reverend had drifted nearer, fascinatingly anxious to be useful. "I do hope," he said, wringing his hands in what he perhaps supposed was discretion. "I do hope nothing untoward occurred with the organ. It is a delicate instrument, and we have struggled with a cipher's problem of late. Perhaps the strain—" "Organs don't lay hands beneath the jaw, Vicar," Dr. Penrose said, and the Reverend withdrew, abashed but not truly enlightened. The county inspector arrived sooner than expected, summoned by both wire and a coincidental motor journey. Inspector Mayhew was a square, tidy man, with a mustache that seemed to have been ruled with a pencil. He set about things briskly, sealing off the nave with a twine boundary that was far more solemn in effect than in substance, and calling for statements in the vestry, which had the unfortunate consequence of placing people exactly where they had been least calm an hour before. Miss Marple, who knew the emotional meaning of rooms, considered that a pity. Still, order of any kind is a comfort to policemen and some parishioners. The first to give an account was Mrs. Rudd, who trembled and insisted on tea. Then came Ivy Barlow, whose hands twisted the hem of her shawl until the weave looked like seaweed. "I was putting hymnals out," she said, glancing at the Reverend as if for permission to remember. Mr. Sims came in to fetch one that had a mark he wanted to compare. He said some page numbers were wrong in a few, and he liked them proper. He smiled at me. Then I went to the back pew because Mrs. Rudd had asked me to sit with her, her legs being unsteady lately. That's all. "Did he speak to anyone else?" Mayhew asked. "Not that I saw," Ivy said. But then she hesitated, and hesitation is its own kind of confession. "Only George Blakely asked him if he'd fix that thing in the pedal. Mr. Sims said it hadn't needed fixing, it needed cleaning." "George Blakely," Mayhew said. And George stepped in, the room seeming smaller for his presence. "I just wanted the music to come right. The harvest service was a muddle, sir. Reverend said perhaps Mr. Sims would make it neat." George held himself like a man who doesn't wish to be altered by any conversation. He did not mention, and no one asked, that his family had paid for the organ's last repair. Generosity is often silent until mischief wakes it. Edwin Blakely came separately, late for his own statement, as for most other obligations. He had the pleasant, faintly oily manner of a man who likes to be liked and has made it his best trade. He too had a small exchange to report. He said the tremulant was abused, Edwin offered, smiling as if the word were a compliment. I said it sounded very fine for the wedding last month. He said perhaps if one prefers seasickness. I took no offense. Mayhew marked something in his notebook, which filled with words as neatly as a churchyard with stones. Reverend Pottle, when his turn came, was the very image of conscientious vagueness. "He was in the vestry when I fetched my notes," he said. "Very polite. He asked if I had any cloth that left no lint. I offered the fair linen, of course not for that purpose, only to show him the weave. He said it was excellent for altars and ruinous for reeds." Then Joel Noakes, who clutched his cap the way one clutches guilt even when one has none. "I made up the fire in the little stove of the organ to take the damp off," he said, "as I always do when the weather's like this." He said not to make a blaze of it, which I wasn't. Then I went to look at the rope. "You were alone in the tower?" "Well, there's no one else there of a Sunday when the bell's done its work." "How long?" Joel shifted. "A quarter of an hour, maybe. I went up before the call to prayer. I was back for when they started singing." "And you saw Mr. Sims again?" "No, sir." "Did you notice anything out of place at the back?" Joel thought, scowled at the disorder of memory, then brightened. "Only that someone dropped a feather." "A feather?" Mayhew's eyebrow moved by a fraction. "Black," Joel said. "On the steps. Could be one of them hat things from the big city. Or a rook if it strayed indoors, which I don't tolerate." Miss Marple did not reach for her pocket. She merely adjusted her glove. "Thank you," Mayhew said. "We shall examine it." He did not say how, which was just as well. Dr. Penrose had already arranged for the body to be taken along to Melchester for a post-mortem. Until then, they had this: a man who had come to tune an organ and had instead been silenced forever. A mark under his jaw that suggested a firm, brief hand. A flurry at the back pews where women fussed and men pretended steadiness. And a feather that might have been a nothing but felt like a line drawn with deliberate ink. It would have satisfied some to settle on a simple story. Mr. Sims had a seizure. Mr. Sims choked discreetly. Mr. Sims had been in poor health. But the village did not remain tidy beneath its surface any more than the church's stones remained dry beneath their moss. As the afternoon slipped toward a pale sunset, Mayhew and Sergeant Cray went to speak with Mrs. Platt at her lodging house. Miss Marple, who had an errand quite on the way to the ironmongery, strolled along after a suitable interval and found herself, quite by accident, within hearing of Mrs. Platt's vexed recitation. "He came with a little case," Mrs. Platt said, "and a roll of felt, very neat manners. Asked if I'd mind him going early to the church to catch the air quiet. Had a cup of tea, nothing else, no bacon. Said he didn't like to play after bacon. Strange, I thought, but one hears worse." "Any callers?" Mayhew asked. "Only a note delivered last evening," Mrs. Platt said. "From someone as laid no name. Just a folded bit pushed under the door. He read it, went tight about the mouth and tore it in two and said it was nothing." "What did it say?" "How would I know?" Mrs. Platt bridled. "It was torn before I saw. I only swept the pieces into the bin this morning." "May we see the bin?" "If you like," she said, and led them to the yard, where ashes and peelings and the stiff backs of yesterday's letters lay alike beneath a crust of damp. Mayhew, with the patience of a man used to looking into unpromising containers, found 2 scraps with ink. One showed the curve of a capital letter, B or R. Another, the bottom halves of the words more and ing. Morning, perhaps, or morning. Miss Marple, who was careful not to look too hard, thought how many words begin with a capital B in a village where the Blakely brothers are one's nearest consonants. "We shall take these," Mayhew said, wrapping them in paper, "and we shall return the rest to its domestic destiny." He was not without humor, which is reassuring in policemen until it isn't. As they left, Miss Marple's errand at the ironmongery turned out to be a question about tacks too small to be useful, which Mr. Hale appreciated philosophically. And then she went home by the longer lane where the hedges grew high and the rooks gathered in black debate. The feather in her pocket felt less like a token and more like a sentence whose grammar she had yet to understand. She made tea with careful hands. In the small sitting room, where the light fell on old china and older chairs, she sat and considered. In her experience, murder, and she was more than halfway to the word now, had a rhythm. This one had begun with a hush and then a sudden stop, as if a musician had struck a wrong chord and then lifted both hands at once. A pressure under the jaw, a death that could pass for a faint if one wished it to. That suggested speed and certainty, but not necessarily strength. A woman could do it, if she had reason and the coolness to stand near him as the hymn drew to its close. A man could do it, if he had the sort of face that did not call attention when placed beside another's. A lover? A debtor? A man with a grievance about instruments. People injure each other in the ways that are already familiar to them. It is economy as much as character. She thought of Ivy's tightened mouth, of George's rigid set, of Edwin's agreeable emptiness, of the Reverend's hurt vanity masked as theology, of Joel's affronted caretaking. She thought, too, of the letter pushed under a door and torn in two, the kind of message one receives when someone is tired of waiting for one's attention. The inspector would make a list, as was right, and the list would have names. Her own list had none yet, only patterns. And just as she was being scolded by her conscience for ornamenting patterns with people, there came a tap at her gate, and a face peered in. Mrs. Little, as it happened, who could never keep a curiosity overnight. "I've thought of something," she announced, invited or not, bustling into the sitting room with a rustle like a shrub disturbed by a cat. "It's about the feather. Oh, I knew you'd want to know." Mrs. Blakely wore a hat with black trimming last Christmas, the fate one, and she said it was an heirloom from her aunt in London. And I said it looked very city and very proud, and she said she only takes it out for high, days and holy days, and today is both a Sunday and a day of sorrow. Though we didn't know the sorrow till later, which is interesting in itself, and so Miss Marple poured her a cup of tea to slow the river. Mrs. Blakely was not at church this morning, she said gently. You will remember, she went to care for her sister in Crowthorne last week. She wrote to the Mothers' Union about the raffle. Well, Mrs. Little said, halfway daunted and only halfway corrected. Then somebody else wore a hat with something like it, because I saw a flutter when the breeze came in at the gospel reading. I am almost sure I did. A flutter, Miss Marple repeated, as if tasting a new jam. From which pew, dear? Oh, from the back along where Ivy sits when she's with Mrs. Rudd. But you'll say it was only the hymn pages. I might, Miss Marple said, quite amiably. And when Mrs. Little had finally allowed herself to be escorted to the gate and down the lane, Miss Marple returned to her chair and the black feather, which she took out at last and laid upon the saucer, as if it too might like a sip of tea before it told her what it was about. At dusk, the inspector returned to the church with Sergeant Cray and Joel to measure distances and test sight lines. Miss Marple, unseen across the road, regarded the open door with its cool, breathing dark. The back pews were a dim geometry of shadow. If one stood just so, and the organ drone covered a small struggle, only a moment, mind you, then what would follow could appear to be the weariness of a traveler kneeling where he ought to have sung. It would require timing and a kind of boldness that looks, in daylight, like domestic confidence. She had seen it before in St. Mary Mead. A hand that did just enough and no more, because too much draws attention. The rooks rose at last from the elms and turned the sky to ink. Miss Marple folded the feather back into her handkerchief. In the morning she would call upon Mrs. Rudd, then upon Mrs. Platt. One always began with women who had washed cups within the last 24 hours. And perhaps, if circumstances allowed, she would contrive to say something careless about egret trimmings in the ironmongery when Edwin Blakely next drifted in. It was not that she suspected. It was that she preferred to see what people did when they believed they had nothing to hide. And even as she formed this gentle plan, a small recollection arrived, as small recollections often do at the day's end. The sexton's broom leaning at the odd angle that morning, the smear on the step, the scuff as if someone had turned sharply where one does not turn unless about to meet or avoid someone else. The village would sleep with one eye open tonight. Miss Marple, who did not always obey the advice she gave, would sleep well. The dead man could not tell her who had pressed a hand beneath his jaw, but the living, oh, the living could hardly help themselves. By Monday morning, the village had dressed itself again in the quiet habits of everyday life, or at least the appearance of them. The baker's bell rang, the milk cart clinked its bottles at each gate, and smoke rose thinly from chimneys along the high street. Yet beneath these familiar movements ran the persistent current of talk, a murmur that swelled whenever two people met within earshot of a third. Little Bramble had not seen a death in its church in living memory, and the novelty, however grim, exerted its pull on the mind. Miss Marple, sitting at her breakfast table with a neatly cut slice of toast, could hear the voices of Mrs. Rudd and her neighbor, Mrs. Harkness, carrying across the hedge. The tone was hushed, but the cadence betrayed their eagerness. Mrs. Rudd, of course, had placed herself at the center of the story, her role as first to cry out in the church magnified with each telling. She was now recounting, possibly for the third time since dawn, how Mr. Sims had slumped forward as if someone had switched him off like a lamp, and how she, quick thinking in her alarm, had shouted for help. Mrs. Harkness murmured agreement, though Miss Marple could tell by the shortness of her replies that she was less interested in the details than in gauging how much Mrs. Rudd might know beyond her own part in the scene. After clearing her plate and wiping her fingers on a linen napkin, Miss Marple prepared for her morning calls. Her first destination was indeed Mrs. Rudd's small brick house at the edge of the green. She arrived with the air of one bringing comfort rather than inquiry, a small jar of crabapple jelly in her bag. Mrs. Rudd, flattered, ushered her in at once, and within minutes the kettle was hissing. "It's a terrible thing, Miss Marple," she said, pouring out 2 cups with a trembling hand that seemed only half caused by shock. "Imagine, murder in the house of God, and I sitting right next to him, no more than a few inches away. If it had been some sort of madness, why, I might be lying there myself." Miss Marple inclined her head sympathetically. "You must have been very near indeed. Did you notice anything unusual in his manner before the hymn ended?" Mrs. Rudd frowned in concentration. "No, not as such. He was a polite man, quiet. Though—" She stopped, the memory forming even as she spoke. "When the Reverend began the gospel reading, I thought he shifted a little, as if someone behind him had touched his shoulder. I only saw it out of the corner of my eye. I thought nothing of it at the time. Perhaps just a draft from the door." Miss Marple made a small sound of understanding, tucking that fragment into the growing picture in her mind. "And you saw no one leave the pew until after you cried out?" "No, dear, though Ivy Barlow was on my other side, and she stood up quick when I did, almost before I'd turned. She said later she thought he was fainting." Leaving Mrs. Rudd with the sense of having contributed something valuable to justice, Miss Marple walked on toward the lodging house of Mrs. Platt. The widow greeted her with a wary glance. The inspector had been by again that morning, and she had no wish to be thought careless in her duties as a landlady. But Miss Marple's visit was couched in the mild tones of neighborly interest. And soon Mrs. Platt was lamenting the whole affair over a pot of stewed tea. "It's not the sort of thing you expect of an organ tuner," she said. "They're usually fussy about dust and pipes, but that's as far as it goes. He was a tidy lodger, paid in advance, never left his boots where they'd trip you." "And no one called on him?" Miss Marple asked gently. "No one. Except—" Mrs. Platt hesitated, glancing at the door to make sure it was shut. "There was a man in a dark coat standing across the road late on Saturday evening. He didn't knock or come in, but I saw Mr. Sims glance that way from the window before he drew the curtain. He looked as if he'd rather not be seen looking." Miss Marple murmured something about the curious comings and goings of strangers and, after a few more remarks, took her leave. That small note of unease from Saturday night chimed neatly with the torn letter and the feather, though she had yet to see how they would fit together. She had just turned into the lane toward the church when she encountered George Blakely, carrying a coil of rope over one shoulder. He nodded curtly. "Replacing the frayed line?" Miss Marple asked with a smile. "Joel's idea," he said. "Says the old one wouldn't last another month. I told him it's still serviceable, but he likes things done his way." Miss Marple glanced at the rope. "A wise precaution, I suppose. Things do have a habit of breaking at the most inconvenient moments." George gave a noncommittal grunt, then added, "It's a shame about Sims. Never spoke more than a handful of words to me, but he knew his craft." He shifted the rope and gave her a brief look. "Some folk are saying it was foul play. That true?" Miss Marple's eyes rested on his face for a moment. "It seems the authorities are not ruling it out." He nodded once, as if that were enough, and walked on. The church itself was locked, but the sexton was just coming out of the vestry. Joel Noakes greeted her with his usual stiff politeness. "I hear you noticed a feather," Miss Marple said. "That I did. Not there now, of course. Inspector took it, or maybe the sergeant. Said it might mean something. Odd place for it on the steps. I'd swept there not half an hour before." "You swept before the service?" "Yes, always do. Bit of leaf fall this time of year, and I like it clean for the parishioners." She thanked him and made her way slowly back through the village, her mind touching lightly on each fact, as a pianist might test a series of keys. A feather where it should not be, a man seen across the road, a shift in posture during the gospel reading, a rope replaced, and a torn letter that had stiffened a man's expression before he destroyed it. They were pieces, but not yet connected. At the post office, she met Ivy Barlow, who looked as though she would rather avoid being spoken to. But Miss Marple's greeting was so kindly that she could not easily retreat. "You must have had a shock, my dear, sitting so near the poor man," Miss Marple said. "It was dreadful," Ivy admitted. "I've hardly slept. Every time I close my eyes, I see him falling forward." "You were behind him at first, were you not?" "Yes. Mrs. Rudd asked me to sit with her after I'd put the hymnals out. I had to walk past him to get to my place. I think I brushed against his shoulder. Only lightly. He didn't turn." "And during the service?" Ivy hesitated, her gaze flicking toward the shop window. "I thought I saw George looking at him oddly, just for a moment. Then the hymn ended and, well, you know the rest." Miss Marple did indeed, but she thanked Ivy warmly, leaving her with the impression that she had been very helpful. By the time she returned home, the autumn light had begun to fade. She set her kettle to boil and considered what she had learned. The movements in the church now formed a kind of map in her mind, where each person had been, who had passed near the victim, who had reason to approach. She could see the moment when the hymn ended, the slight shifting of bodies, the cover of the organ's steady tone. It was not yet a clear picture, but she had learned long ago that clarity comes in layers, each thin as tissue until at last the whole scene stands revealed. For now, she would wait, watch, and let the village talk itself toward the truth, as it inevitably would. The inspector might return with questions, the doctor with results, the gossip with embellishments. But Miss Marple would be ready to hear what mattered and let the rest fall away, like a feather from a hat. Tuesday dawned pale and thin, the sky the color of washed muslin. A light frost silvered the grass in the churchyard, crunching under the boots of Joel Noakes as he unlocked the vestry door. Across the street, Miss Marple stood at her gate, fastening her coat. She had an air of mild purpose about her, the sort of look one might wear when intent upon nothing more than returning a borrowed book. But those who knew her well would have recognized the faint glimmer in her eyes that meant she had decided upon a morning's quiet work. The postman came early, trundling his bicycle up the lane, and among the envelopes slipped through Miss Marple's letterbox was a thin note from Inspector Mayhew. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, its contents briefer still. Post-mortem confirms asphyxia. No other injuries. Time of death likely within 3 minutes of collapse. Will call this afternoon. She read it twice, her mind alighting on the word within. 3 minutes in which the entire congregation had been standing, heads bowed or bent to hymnals. Long enough for a hand to be pressed swiftly and firmly under a jaw, short enough for no one to remark on anything beyond a shifting in the pew. Such things were easy to miss when one's eyes were elsewhere. Harder still to remember afterward, without a trace of doubt. After breakfast, she set off toward the high street. The day's first stop was the ironmongery, where Edwin Blakely was sweeping the front step with unnecessary care. He looked up with his habitual pleasantness. "Morning, Miss Marple. Can I tempt you with some new brads? Got a shipment in from Melchester, polished heads, very neat." "Not this morning, thank you, Edwin. I was just wondering, did you see much of Mr. Sims on Sunday before the service?" Edwin leaned on the broom, thinking. "Only in passing. He came in here the day before for a bit of thin oil, the sort for fine mechanisms. Said he liked to keep the pedals smooth, paid in cash. I mentioned my brother George would be glad of the repair, and he smiled, though I couldn't tell if it was agreement or just politeness." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "You're certain it was oil for the pedals?" "That's what he said. Could have been for the stops, I suppose. But he seemed to know what he wanted." "Why do you ask?" "Oh, no reason in particular. I've heard organists can be particular about these things." She smiled gently, thanked him, and moved on. The next call was at the vicarage. Reverend Pottle, though eager to appear composed, still bore the distracted look of a man whose parish had been violated by something beyond his liturgical imagination. "I do hope you're not here about the dreadful business," he began, ushering her into a study cluttered with parish notices and teacups. "Only to offer my sympathy, Vicar," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair. "And perhaps to ask, was Mr. Sims in the vestry alone before the service?" The Reverend blinked. "Alone?" "No, not quite. I passed through to fetch my sermon notes and found George Blakely there, polishing the candlesticks. He said the brass had grown dull, and I told him it was kind of him to notice. Mr. Sims arrived just as I was leaving." Miss Marple nodded, storing the detail away. "And you left them both there?" "I did. Only a minute or two. Then I heard the bell and went to the porch." The vicar's voice carried no hint of suspicion, but Miss Marple knew well how much could happen in a minute or two, particularly when no one thought to remember it. Leaving the vicarage, she took the long way round to Mrs. Harkness's, for the woman was known to hear more than she ought, often by means she declined to explain. The kettle was already boiling when Miss Marple arrived. Within moments, Mrs. Harkness was deep in the comfortable pleasure of sharing a morsel she had not yet repeated too widely. "I was near the back, you know," she said. "Could see the whole pew where Mr. Sims sat. And I swear, just before the hymn ended, someone leaned forward from behind and put a hand on the back of the pew. I didn't see whose hand. It was in shadow, but it was there, sure as I'm sitting here." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "A large hand? Small? Medium, I'd say. Not rough, not soft. Just there for a second, then gone." It was another scrap for the growing patchwork, another angle on the same brief moment in which a man had ceased to breathe. By the time she returned home for luncheon, the village seemed quieter, as if aware that the inspector's arrival might stir the pot again. He came promptly at 2, striding up the path with Sergeant Cray in tow. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," Mayhew said. "Thought I'd share the doctor's report before it hits the gossips. No signs of a struggle, nothing under the nails, no bruising beyond the pressure point. Whoever did it knew exactly how much force to use." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I dare say it requires both knowledge and opportunity." "Exactly. I've narrowed the field to those within arm's reach during the hymn. Mrs. Rudd, Ivy Barlow, and whoever sat directly behind Mr. Sims. Trouble is, that last bit changes depending on who's telling it. Some say George Blakely, some say Edwin. One says no one at all." Miss Marple's knitting lay idle in her lap. "You might consider where the hymnals were placed before the service. A person arranging them could have chosen a seat deliberately afterward. Mayhew's eyes narrowed slightly. You think it was planned in advance? I think, Miss Marple said gently, that a certain sort of mind will always take the trouble to arrange its scene. He grunted, making a note. We've also been looking at the torn letter from Mrs. Platt's bin. Can't get much from it. But the lab in Melchester says the paper's from a hotel notepaper stock, one of the larger places. That and the feather might be our only tangible bits. Miss Marple did not volunteer that the feather was in her possession. There are times when a clue serves best by being kept out of official sight until its proper moment. As the inspector and sergeant left, the late afternoon sun caught the leaded glass of her sitting room window, throwing small, broken rainbows across the carpet. She sat for a while in the shifting light, turning over the day's conversations. George Blakely, alone with Mr. Sims in the vestry. A hand seen briefly on the back of the pew. A man in a dark coat outside the lodging house. Oil for fine mechanisms. A letter from a hotel. And that feather, black and sleek, dropped where it would certainly be seen, if not taken away. The pattern was still incomplete, but the outlines were forming. She could almost hear the faint hum of the organ, masking a movement no one thought to question. Until the hymn stopped and the silence spoke louder than any music. That night, as the frost settled again over Little Bramble, Miss Marple prepared her plan for the morning. It would be time, she thought, to speak again to Ivy Barlow. This time not about what she had seen, but about what she might have been meant to see. And perhaps, if the moment presented itself, she would mention hats and trimmings, and the curious way a feather will sometimes loosen without the wearer noticing. Unless, of course, it was meant to be noticed. In Little Bramble, intentions often wore the face of accidents, and accidents sometimes proved to have been rehearsed all along. The next morning dawned with a thin ribbon of mist clinging low over the meadows, softening the hedgerows and making the cottages of Little Bramble look as though they had been sketched in pale watercolor. Miss Marple, who never relied on the weather to determine her day's work, had already determined that her first call would be upon Ivy Barlow. She took with her a small basket of scones, still warm from the oven, a gesture of kindness that rarely failed to loosen tongues. Ivy's small terraced house sat just beyond the post office, its front garden lined with drooping hollyhocks now past their prime. The girl answered the door with a hint of hesitation, her eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. "Oh, Miss Marple, that's very kind," she murmured, taking the basket. "Do come in, if you don't mind the place being a bit untidy." Miss Marple stepped into the narrow parlor, her eyes taking in the details without seeming to. 2 cups on the table when Ivy lived alone, a pair of men's gloves draped over the arm of a chair, and a faint scent of something sharper than tea lingering in the air. "I was thinking of you, my dear," Miss Marple said as she settled into the nearest chair. After such a shock, it can be difficult to remember the order of things. Sometimes, though, talking them through helps. Ivy gave a wan smile. "I've told the inspector everything I can remember." "Oh, I'm sure you have," Miss Marple agreed. "But you see, the smallest details, the things that seem unimportant, can sometimes be just the very thing to make sense of it all. For instance, on Sunday you moved from the back to sit beside Mrs. Rudd, did you not?" "Yes. She called me over before the hymn. I'd finished putting the hymnals out." "And in passing Mr. Sims's pew, you brushed against his shoulder?" Ivy nodded. "Lightly. I didn't mean to, just the aisle's so narrow. He didn't look at me." Miss Marple watched her carefully. "And when you sat down, where was George Blakely?" A pause, too long for mere thought. "Behind him, in the next pew." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. My dear, are you quite certain? Because Mrs. Harkness mentioned seeing a hand on the back of Mr. Sims's pew just before the hymn ended. A man's hand, she thought. Ivy's lips tightened, and she glanced toward the gloves on the chair before looking away. Perhaps she's mistaken. I wasn't watching George. Miss Marple let the silence stretch, the faint tick of the mantel clock filling the room. You know, Ivy, she said at last, I've often found that people sometimes notice more than they realize. Only they're afraid it might mean trouble for someone they care about. Ivy's hands twisted together in her lap. George isn't cruel, but he can be short-tempered. He wanted the organ fixed for the harvest service and was angry when it wasn't. He said Mr. Sims was making work of nothing. Did they quarrel? I wouldn't call it that. But George doesn't like being contradicted. Her voice faltered, then steadied. If you're thinking he... She stopped herself, pressing her lips into silence. Miss Marple only patted her hand and rose. Well, I shall leave you to your scones, my dear. Do have one while they're still warm. Out in the lane, the air was sharper, the mist thinning into streaks of pale blue sky. Miss Marple's next stop was the church, where Joel Noakes was once again in the porch with his broom. Morning, Miss Marple, he said. Inspector was here earlier, measuring again. Was he indeed? And did he find anything new? Joel shrugged. Didn't say. But I told him about that scuff on the step. Said it looked fresh, like someone turned sudden. Funny thing is, it wasn't there when I swept before the service. Miss Marple looked thoughtful. So it must have happened between your sweeping and the hymn. That's right. Which means it was one of the first people in. The Blakeleys came early, and so did Ivy. Her mind was turning the possibilities when Inspector Mayhew himself emerged from the vestry. Ah, Miss Marple. Good timing. I've just spoken to Dr. Penrose again. He's certain the method used required precision. Pressure under the jaw at just the right angle to cut off the airway swiftly. Not something you'd expect most folk to know. Unless they'd seen it done before, Miss Marple murmured. Or been shown, Mayhew agreed. Which makes me think we're not looking at a spur-of-the-moment quarrel, but something planned. And the letter? She asked. He smiled wryly. We traced the notepaper to the King's Head Hotel in Melchester. Staff remember a man matching Sims's description meeting someone in the lounge last Thursday. Couldn't recall the other party clearly, hat brim pulled low. But one of the waiters said he heard the word payment more than once. Miss Marple's knitting fingers itched, though she carried no needles with her. A debt, perhaps, or the settling of one. Mayhew nodded. We'll keep pressing on that. But I'd be obliged if you'd keep your ears open. Folk will say things to you they won't say to me. As he left, she found herself thinking again of the black feather, of how neatly it had lain on the step as if placed there. A signal? A warning? Or a trace of vanity, carelessly or deliberately shed? Her afternoon was spent quietly in the High Street, pausing to speak with Mrs. Harkness again and with Mr. Hale at the ironmongery, who remembered seeing Edwin Blakely walking toward the church early on Sunday with a parcel under his arm. Flat and wrapped in brown paper, he said. Could have been anything. Miss Marple returned home before dusk, her mind knitting its own pattern. She could see now that there had been a deliberate convergence in the minutes before the hymn. George in the vestry with Mr. Sims, Ivy moving past him into the pew, Edwin arriving with a parcel and a letter in the victim's pocket from a meeting that might not have gone as planned. That evening, as she sat by the fire, she found herself remembering something Mrs. Platt had said almost in passing. That Mr. Sims had refused bacon on Sunday morning because he did not like to play after bacon. It was an odd remark, so oddly specific, it seemed almost like a ritual. And rituals, she knew, could be interrupted in ways that unsettled a person, made them careless. Somewhere among these small peculiarities, among the gloves in Ivy's parlor, the scuff on the church step, the parcel under Edwin's arm, and the feather that had drawn her eye before anything else, lay the key to the whole business. Miss Marple poured herself another cup of tea and allowed the possibilities to drift into place. Someone had wanted Mr. Sims silenced quickly and without scene, using the very moment when heads were bowed in prayer and hymn. The question was not only who had the knowledge and the opportunity, but who had the nerve to perform so precise an act, in so public a place, and then sit quietly, as if nothing had happened. She knew by now that the answer was there, in plain sight, waiting for her to lift it gently into the light. And when she did, she would have to do it carefully, because in Little Bramble, as in all small villages, the shock of a murderer among them would ripple far longer than the sound of any Sunday bell. Wednesday brought with it a watery sun, its pale rays filtering through the thin morning mist and spilling across Little Bramble in a way that seemed almost too gentle for a village carrying such a grim undercurrent. The events of Sunday still lay like a film over every conversation. The usual exchanges about weather or gardening were quickly abandoned in favor of cautious speculation about Mr. Sims's fate. People lowered their voices when speaking of it in the street, but the moment a door shut behind them, tones rose and hands gestured freely. Miss Marple took her tea earlier than usual and set out with a purpose. She had decided the day before that there were certain matters best addressed in sequence, as one might thread a needle before sewing on a button. Her first visit would be to Edwin Blakely, who was usually behind the counter of the ironmongery by mid-morning. She found him there now, arranging boxes of screws with a precision that seemed slightly forced. "Good morning, Edwin," she said, stepping inside with her usual pleasantness. "You're looking industrious today." Edwin smiled in that easy, faintly oily way of his. "One must keep busy, Miss Marple. These things don't sell themselves." She glanced at the counter, where a scrap of brown paper lay folded beside the till. "I was just passing and thought I'd ask. Mr. Hale mentioned seeing you walking toward the church early on Sunday, carrying a parcel. I dare say it was something entirely ordinary. But I'm a curious old woman." His smile stiffened slightly. "Ah, yes, that. Just a new length of felt for the pedal board. George asked me to fetch it from the storeroom. Thought Mr. Sims might as well fit it while he was here." "Did you give it to Mr. Sims directly?" Edwin hesitated, then shook his head. "No, I left it in the vestry. George was there, said he'd pass it along. I went out to see about the candlesticks." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "How very helpful of you." She left the shop with that detail sitting neatly atop the others she had collected. The parcel explained itself on the surface, but she had learned to be wary of explanations that were offered too readily, especially when accompanied by a smile. Her next stop was Mrs. Platt's lodging house. The widow had clearly been expecting her. The parlor was tidier than usual, and the tea things were laid out on a tray. "You've heard nothing more from the police, I suppose?" Miss Marple asked as she accepted a cup. "Only that they've been to Melchester about that hotel paper," Mrs. Platt said. "I told them again about the man in the dark coat on Saturday night. I couldn't see his face, but I'm sure he was watching the house." "And Mr. Sims saw him too?" "Oh, yes. He was at the window before he drew the curtain. He didn't say anything, but his mouth went tight, like a line drawn with a ruler." Miss Marple sipped her tea. Did he go out after that? Numbers stayed in his room all evening. I heard him moving about, but he never came down. It was another small thread in the fabric she was piecing together. Whoever had been outside that night might well have been in church the next morning, or might have relied on someone else to be there in his place. From Mrs. Platt's, she made her way to the vicarage. Reverend Pottle received her in his study, though his attention seemed elsewhere, his fingers fiddling with the edge of a parish notice. "I wonder, Vicar," she began mildly, "whether you might recall exactly who was in the vestry before the service began on Sunday." He looked faintly flustered. "Why, let me see. George Blakely was polishing the candlesticks, as I mentioned before. Mr. Sims came in soon after. I believe Edwin passed through, though I didn't speak with him. Joel Noakes came in to light the little stove for the organ, then went up to the bell tower. After that, I was at the porch to greet the congregation." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And no one else that you noticed?" "No one I can recall." It was consistent with what she had already been told. But consistency could be as misleading as contradiction when more than one person was shaping the story. By midday, she was back at her cottage, where she allowed herself a light luncheon and half an hour's knitting before the inspector arrived. Mayhew came briskly, Sergeant Cray in tow, a folder of notes tucked under his arm. "We've traced the man in the dark coat," he said without preamble. "Hotel staff in Melchester think it might be a fellow named Roper. Bit of a shady type. Did some work as a piano repairer before getting into debt. No fixed address now. We've sent word to neighboring stations to look out for him." "And his connection to Mr. Sims?" "Best guess is they knew each other through the trade. If there was money owed, that might explain the word payment overheard at the hotel." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "And yet, Inspector, Mr. Roper may not have been the one in the church." "True enough. We've narrowed the moment of death to within that hymn, 3 minutes, perhaps less. Which means we're looking for someone with both access and knowledge. The feather, the scuff on the step, the letter, they're all small things. But I don't yet see how they join up." Miss Marple's gaze was mild. "Sometimes the smallest things are not to be joined at all, but rather to be removed until the shape left behind makes sense." Mayhew gave her a wry look. "You're keeping something back." "I am keeping only what is not yet ready to be used." That afternoon, she walked out to the churchyard again, taking care to arrive when the place was quiet. The porch still smelled faintly of polish and cold stone. She stood where Mrs. Rudd had been seated, looking toward Mr. Sims's pew, and imagined the organ's steady drone filling the space. In her mind's ear, she could hear the hymn ending, the momentary pause before the next part of the service, enough time for a hand to rise from the pew behind, press just so under the jaw, and retreat as the congregation lifted their heads. The feather might have fallen then, dislodged from a hat by the movement. The scuff on the step could have come from a quick turn, someone stepping out of the way or into position. The parcel of felt left in the vestry might have been a pretext for entering early. As she turned to leave, she almost collided with Ivy Barlow, who had come in carrying a spray of chrysanthemums. "Paying your respects?" Miss Marple asked gently. Ivy nodded, setting the flowers near the front. "It just feels right, somehow. He was kind to me, said I had a good singing voice." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Kindness can make us remember people more clearly than we realize. And sometimes it makes us notice things we wouldn't otherwise." Ivy's eyes flickered, but she said nothing more. Back at home, as dusk crept across the village, Miss Marple laid out her thoughts in the order they had arrived. George alone with Mr. Sims in the vestry, Edwin delivering a parcel, Ivy moving past the victim into her seat, the feather on the step, the scuff on the stone, the letter from the hotel, the man in the dark coat. Each was a piece, but the picture they formed was still faint, like an old photograph waiting for its final wash of developer. She knew now that the answer would not lie in any single clue, but in how the murderer had made use of the church's own stillness, the congregation's own bowed heads. And when she found the right way to ask the right question, the person responsible would show themselves, not by what they admitted, but by what they could not keep from revealing. For in Little Bramble, it was never the loudest voice that gave the game away. It was the smallest change in tone, the tiniest movement of the eyes, things Miss Marple had spent a lifetime noticing. And she was certain that before the week was out, she would notice the one that mattered most. Thursday morning was crisp and bright, the kind of day that might have tempted most villagers to turn their thoughts to mundane matters, shopping, mending, the early pruning of roses, were it not for the persistent shadow of Sunday's events. The murder at St. Mildred's had become the village's single fixed point. Every conversation, however it began, seemed inevitably to drift toward it. Miss Marple had risen early, her breakfast taken while the frost still clung in delicate lace along her garden wall. She had decided overnight that it was time to disturb the calm waters a little. Some people, she knew, were most revealing when they felt they were steering the conversation. Others, when they were gently provoked into defending themselves. Her first call was to George Blakely. She found him in the small yard behind his cottage, chopping kindling with the deliberate force of a man accustomed to working in silence. "Good morning, George," she called lightly over the fence. He straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "Miss Marple, you're up early." "One does one's errands before the shops grow busy. I wanted to ask, on Sunday morning when you were in the vestry with Mr. Sims, did you notice anyone passing by?" George frowned. Edwin came in for a moment, left some parcel on the bench. Joel was fussing with the stove. Otherwise, no. "And you spoke with Mr. Sims?" "Briefly, about the organ. He said the fault was with the cleaning, not the mechanism. I told him he'd better sort it quickly, that's all." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him. "A difference of opinion can be quite bracing, don't you think? Provided it ends there." He gave her a hard look, the kind that weighed words before releasing them. "I had no quarrel with the man. If you're hinting otherwise." "Oh, not at all, George. Only conversation is so easily misread." She smiled, thanked him, and moved on, leaving him staring after her. Her next visit was less direct. She called at the post office, where Mrs. Harkness was collecting stamps. A few casual remarks about the weather led swiftly to the inevitable subject. "You know," Mrs. Harkness said, lowering her voice, "I saw something else that morning. I didn't think it mattered, but perhaps it does. Just before the service, I noticed Edwin standing in the porch talking to Ivy Barlow. Looked rather intent, if you ask me." Miss Marple made a mild sound of interest. "And did they come in together?" "No. Edwin came in first, Ivy a moment later. But it struck me at the time they didn't much want to be seen together." From the post office, Miss Marple walked down toward the church, knowing she would likely find Joel Noakes there. The sexton was indeed in the porch, polishing the brass latch on the door. "I was thinking about the scuff you mentioned," she said. "You're quite sure it wasn't there when you swept?" "Certain, and I'd know whose boot made it if I saw the tread, It was a man's shoe, I'd wager, broad with a worn edge on the heel. That, Miss Marple thought, might be just the kind of detail the inspector would find useful, if handled at the right time. Back at her cottage, she had just settled to her knitting when Inspector Mayhew called. He looked more thoughtful than usual. "We've found Roper," he announced. "Picked him up in Melchester. Claims he came to Little Bramble to collect money owed by Mr. Sims, but denies setting foot in the church. Says he waited outside on Saturday night, then left when he saw someone else go in. And this someone else? Won't name them. Says it's not his affair, which is suspicious enough on its own. But he does admit he sent a note. Told Sims to have the money ready by morning." Miss Marple tapped her fingers lightly on the arm of her chair. "The torn letter. Exactly. We can place Roper here but not in the church at the time of the murder, which means either he's lying or someone else decided to settle matters for him." She considered this. "Have you thought, Inspector, that the letter may not have been meant to threaten payment at all, but to warn?" He frowned. "Warn of what?" "That," she said, "is the part we have yet to learn." That afternoon, she decided on a small social experiment. She went to the ironmongery, knowing Edwin would be there, and asked him in a perfectly casual voice whether he stocked hat pins. The sort one uses for feathers, you know, so they don't slip. His reaction was swift. Too swift. No call for those these days. Besides, a feather's bound to come loose now and then. Nothing unusual in it. Miss Marple smiled as though agreeing entirely. But she left the shop knowing she had touched a nerve. If the feather had indeed come from his possession, or from someone he was protecting, its presence on the church step was far less innocent than it appeared. Her final call of the day was to Ivy Barlow. She found the girl shelling peas at her kitchen table, the men's gloves still draped over the chair. "I was asking Edwin this afternoon about hat pins," Miss Marple said conversationally. "Such things are hard to find now." Ivy's hand stilled for the briefest moment before she resumed her work. "I wouldn't know. I've never worn anything so fine." "Perhaps not, but you might have been near someone who did." Ivy kept her gaze on the peas. "If you're suggesting—" "My dear, I am suggesting nothing at all," Miss Marple said softly. "Only that small details tend to float to the surface, no matter how deep we try to sink them." She left Ivy with her color slightly heightened, and a certainty growing in her own mind. There was a connection between Edwin, Ivy, and that feather, one that had played out in the few minutes before the hymn ended. That night, as the lamplight fell across her knitting, Miss Marple laid the pieces out in thought once more. Roper's presence and his letter, George in the vestry with Mr. Sims, Edwin delivering a parcel and speaking with Ivy in the porch, Ivy passing the victim to take her seat, the feather, the scuff, the precise method of killing. What she saw now was not a random act, but a choreography. Someone had ensured they were in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right cover, the bowed heads, the organ's hum, the congregation's focus elsewhere. It was, she reflected, a plan that could only have been carried out by someone who knew the church intimately, who understood not only its layout, but its habits and silences. And in Little Bramble, there were only a few who fit that description. The next step, she decided, would be to draw them out, subtly, without warning, until they revealed themselves. She had, after all, learned long ago that the surest way to catch a killer was not to chase them, but to let them walk straight into the snare they didn't know had been laid. Friday morning brought a brittle clarity to Little Bramble. The frost had hardened the garden beds, the air carried the faint scent of coal smoke, and the sound of the milk cart echoed more sharply in the stillness. Miss Marple, sipping her tea by the sitting-room window, watched the village slowly come to life and decided it was the day to spring the first part of her trap. It began, quite innocently, with a rumor. She had learned over many years that a suggestion, once dropped in the right ear, would take root and grow with remarkable speed. And so, after breakfast, she paid a call on Mrs. Little, who was always a reliable gardener of other people's words. "You know," Miss Marple said as they discussed the Mother's Union raffle, "I heard the inspector was very interested in that black feather they found. Apparently they've traced it to a very particular sort of hat, quite uncommon, something one doesn't buy in Little Bramble at all." Mrs. Little's eyes widened, her fingers tightening around her teacup. "You don't say. Well, that's interesting. Very interesting indeed." Miss Marple did not need to say more. She knew the feather would be on everyone's tongue before midday, and the person to whom it mattered most would not be able to ignore it. By late morning, she had the confirmation she expected. On her way to the post office, she saw Edwin Blakely speaking in low tones to Ivy Barlow outside the grocer's. Ivy's face was pale, her hands restless. When she spotted Miss Marple, she offered a quick, tight smile before turning away. Edwin, on the other hand, tried for cheerfulness and overplayed it, offering a greeting far too hearty for the cold air. Miss Marple returned the greeting and passed on without pause, but she stored the moment away. Whatever bound those two together, the feather had touched it. At noon, Inspector Mayhew called at her cottage. "We've had a development," he said, stepping inside. "Roper's alibi for Sunday morning has a hole in it big enough to drive a cart through. He claims he left Little Bramble at first light, but the lorry driver who took him part of the way says it was nearer to 10:30. Still, there's nothing yet to place him inside the church." "And what of the feather?" Miss Marple asked, her tone carefully mild. "It's from a woman's hat, all right. Ostrich plume, dyed black. The sort sold in Melchester, but not many shops keep them now. Might help narrow things if we can find the owner." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "I dare say the owner already knows we're looking." Mayhew raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" "Meaning," she said, "that the knowledge will cause them to move, or to speak, when they might otherwise have kept still." That afternoon, she attended to her second step, a visit to Joel Noakes in the bell tower. She climbed the narrow stairs with the ease of long habit, her gloved hand trailing lightly along the worn stone. Joel was adjusting the rope for Sunday's ring, his brow furrowed. "I've been wondering, Joel," she said, "about that scuff you mentioned. Would you recognize the shoe if you saw it?" He nodded. "Aye. Broad heel, bit of wear on the outside edge." "Then you might keep your eyes open tomorrow when folks come for the Saturday cleaning. People are less careful with their feet when they think no one's looking." Joel gave a slow smile. "I'll do that, Miss Marple." From the tower, she descended to the vestry, standing for a moment where the light from the high window fell across the bench. She imagined Edwin setting down his parcel, George speaking with Mr. Sims, Joel coming and going. It was a narrow space, too narrow for more than one purposeful movement at a time. Back at her cottage, she set about preparing the third and final part of her plan. On Saturday afternoon, the church would be open for flowers and cleaning, as it always was before Sunday service. The congregation would drift in and out, and there would be just enough bustle to conceal a quiet piece of theater. If all went well, the person she suspected would give themselves away. not to the inspector, not to the whole village, but to her. That evening, as the street lamps flickered on and a light mist rose from the meadows, she received an unexpected caller. Ivy Barlow stood at the gate, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. "Miss Marple," she began, her voice low and urgent. "I didn't come to trouble you, but, well, I'm frightened." Miss Marple ushered her inside, poured her a cup of tea, and let her sit by the fire until the color returned to her cheeks. "It's just, people are talking," Ivy went on, "about the feather and about who was near Mr. Sims. I didn't do anything, but what if they think I did? I was close to him when he died, and—" She trailed off. Miss Marple reached across and patted her hand. "My dear, if you've done nothing wrong, then there is nothing to fear. But sometimes, when we are afraid, it is because we are protecting someone else." Ivy's eyes filled, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she might speak, but the girl only shook her head. "I can't." "You mean you won't?" Miss Marple said gently. "There is a difference, and I dare say the time will come very soon when you'll see which choice is the wiser." After Ivy left, Miss Marple sat for a long time, the fire settling to a soft glow. The girl's fear was real, and it was not for herself alone. That much was certain. And in protecting someone, she had placed herself under suspicion, something the true culprit might find very convenient indeed. The next day would be her moment to untangle that convenience and let the truth show itself. All it would take was the right word, the right arrangement of people, and a question that seemed harmless enough, until it wasn't. She slept well that night, her mind at ease in the knowledge that the pattern was nearly complete. All that remained was to see it stitched together, the design clear to everyone, even if it had been in plain sight all along. Saturday morning dawned calm, the village quiet save for the occasional rattle of a cart over cobbles. By mid-afternoon, St. Mildred's was alive with gentle industry. Vases being filled, pews dusted, the faint scent of polish mingling with that of early narcissus. Miss Marple arrived with a small arrangement of winter jasmine, her manner as calm as if she had come for nothing more than to place it on the side altar. But her eyes noted everything. George polishing the candlesticks at the chancel rail, Edwin moving between pews with a cloth, Ivy arranging flowers near the font, Joel at the porch, his gaze sharp for shoes. She moved quietly between them, speaking here and there, always with a question that seemed idle but was placed with care. And then, quite suddenly, she asked Edwin, "Did you ever find that hat pin you dropped on Sunday? I've heard they're not easy to replace." It was a simple question, offered in a voice so mild it could have been about the weather. But Edwin's reaction, a half step back, a glance toward Ivy, and the swift tightening of his jaw, was all she needed. She smiled as though it were nothing, thanked him for his help with the pew cushions, and went on her way, leaving behind the faintest ripple in the calm. It was enough. By the time the inspector arrived that evening to review her observations, she would have everything in place. And when Sunday came, she would be ready to draw the net closed. Sunday morning arrived with a clear, pale sky, the kind of light that showed every frost crystal on the churchyard grass. The bells of St. Mildred sounded as they always did, yet the chime seemed to carry a sharper edge, as if it were aware of the undercurrent running through the village. Word of Miss Marple's hat-pin question had done its quiet work overnight, traveling down lanes, over hedges, and into kitchens, leaving certain ears more alert and certain hands less steady than usual. Miss Marple attended service as was her custom, arriving early enough to note where everyone placed themselves. George Blakely was already at the front, polishing the candlesticks yet again, his back stiff. Edwin hovered at the side aisle, pretending to examine the hymn boards. Ivy Barlow slipped in at the last moment, settling toward the rear beside Mrs. Rudd, her eyes fixed on the floor. Joel Noakes moved between porch and bell tower with his broom, though Miss Marple thought his attention was more on the congregation's feet than the dust. The inspector, seated unobtrusively near the door, had agreed to her plan without entirely knowing what she meant to do. Miss Marple preferred it that way. In her experience, surprises were best when shared at the proper moment. The service began as usual, the organ filling the nave, the vicar's voice measured and steady. The congregation sang the first hymn without incident. Miss Marple's eyes, though lowered to her hymn book, took in everything. Edwin's restless shifting, Ivy's tight shoulders, George's head inclined toward the chancel as though resolutely fixed away from the pews behind him. When the time came for the gospel reading, the church fell into that particular stillness she had counted on, the kind that had cloaked Mr. Sims's death the previous week. Miss Marple turned her head just enough to see the positions. Ivy leaning slightly forward, Edwin 2 pews behind her, George unmoving at the front. And then, at the pause before the vicar's next words, she quietly let her handkerchief slip from her lap into the aisle. The reaction was immediate and telling. Edwin stepped quickly forward, bending to pick it up. But in doing so, his hand brushed the back of Ivy's pew, fingers pressing at exactly the height where Mrs. Harkness had seen a hand the week before. It was a small movement, unnoticed by most. But Miss Marple saw the sudden tightening in Ivy's posture, the same flinch she must have given when Mr. Sims was touched in that final moment. After the service, Miss Marple lingered in the porch with deliberate slowness. The inspector joined her, his eyes sharp. "I saw it," he murmured, "exactly as you described. That touch, it wasn't casual." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "It was a habit. One does not often think of habits as dangerous, but in the right or wrong circumstances, they can be deadly." She asked the inspector to walk with her to the vestry, where George was returning the candlesticks to their place. Edwin and Ivy were nearby, gathering the hymn books. Miss Marple's tone was almost conversational when she spoke. "I expect you're wondering about that feather, Edwin?" she began, her eyes on him, though her voice was mild. "The one found on the church step. It came from a hat with an ostrich plume. Such hats often need a pin to keep them steady, especially if one moves suddenly." "Yours, perhaps?" Edwin's mouth tightened. "I've told you, I don't wear such things." "Of course not. But you might carry one for someone who does. A lady, perhaps, who sits where she can be reached from behind. A lady who would not herself have the strength or the knowledge to kill quickly, but who might be persuaded or frightened into standing where she could be seen to have done so." Ivy gave a sharp gasp. "I didn't." "No, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "I don't think you did. But you were made part of it all the same. You were placed in that pew so the congregation, and later the police, would remember you as being nearest when Mr. Sims collapsed. That way, no one would notice Edwin's hand from behind." The inspector stepped closer. "And the method?" "Pressure beneath the jaw, cutting off the airway quickly and silently," Miss Marple replied. Mr. Sims was seated at the back, his head bent over the hymn book. Edwin only had to lean forward at the pause in the hymn. The organ covered the faintest sound, and Ivy, startled, would naturally turn toward him, making it seem she was the one touching the victim. George turned from the candlesticks, his brow dark. "And why would Edwin want the man dead?" "Because," Miss Marple said, "Mr. Sims had been at the King's Head Hotel meeting a certain Mr. Roper about payment. Roper, I believe, was not the only one owed money. Edwin's accounts at the ironmongerish are delicate. Mr. Sims had found out something, perhaps about funds set aside for the organ repairs that never quite reached their destination. He meant to speak to the vicar about it after the service, and that was more than Edwin could allow. Edwin's face had gone pale, but his voice was defiant. "You can't prove any of that." "On the contrary," Miss Marple said softly, "I believe Joel can. You see," he noticed the scuff on the step after his morning sweep, a mark that matches the worn edge of your right heel. "The same heel you pressed into the stone today when you reached for my handkerchief." Joel, who had been listening from the doorway, nodded grimly. "Saw it plain as day, Inspector. Same tread as Sunday last." The inspector's voice was firm now. "Edwin Blakely, I'll have to ask you to come with me." Ivy's voice broke. "I didn't know what he meant to do. He only told me to sit with Mrs. Rudd so I could help her if she felt faint. I thought he was being kind." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Sometimes kindness is only a mask, my dear. But you've done nothing that cannot be set right." As the inspector led Edwin away, the winter sunlight slanted through the vestry window, catching the dust motes in a slow dance. Miss Marple remained where she was for a moment, her hands folded neatly, her expression unreadable. When at last she stepped out into the churchyard, she saw the village gathering in small knots, the way they always did when news was fresh. By evening, they would all know the story, embroidered and altered in the telling, but with the central truth intact: that a murder had been solved, not by force or bluster, but by watching, listening, and waiting for a hand to repeat its fatal gesture. Later that afternoon, seated once more in her cottage with her knitting, Miss Marple reflected on the case. "People," she murmured to herself, "are so very much like their habits. And habits, once learned, are awfully hard to hide, especially when they think no one is looking." Outside, the bells rang again for evensong, their tone lighter now, as though St. Mildred's itself were relieved. The black feather lay tucked away in her work-basket, a small token of a Sunday morning when stillness had hidden a crime, and patience had uncovered it. The news of Edwin Blakely's arrest moved through Little Bramble with the speed and certainty of a draft under a door. By Sunday evening, every hearth in the village was warming at least one version of the tale, each embroidered with new flourishes and firm opinions. Some claimed Edwin had been a calculating villain for years, hiding behind his pleasant manners. Others insisted he had been driven to it in a moment of panic. A few still wondered whether Ivy Barlow had been more involved than she let on. But those whispers were quieter now, tempered by the inspector's public assurance that she was free of blame. For Miss Marple, the matter was not quite finished. True, the murderer had been named, arrested, and taken away. But the threads of a crime have a way of lingering in the minds and routines of those who were touched by it. It was not simply about restoring peace. It was about understanding the small, human currents that had made such a crime possible in the first place. On Monday morning, the inspector came by her cottage with a sheaf of papers under his arm. "I thought you might like to hear the rest of it, Miss Marple," he said as she showed him into the sitting room. "I should, very much," she replied, pouring tea and placing a plate of currant buns between them. Mayhew settled himself. "We've had a full confession from Edwin. You were right on every point. Sims had discovered discrepancies in the accounts for the organ repairs, checks made out for one amount, but only part of it reaching the work. Edwin had been quietly using the difference to cover debts from a string of ill-advised stock purchases. Sims threatened to tell the vicar, and from there, it wouldn't have been long before the police were called in. Edwin decided it was better to silence him before he could speak. Miss Marple nodded. And so he arranged matters so that Ivy would be nearest the victim, making her the one everyone would remember. Exactly. He even told her to wear a hat from Mrs. Little's charity box, a battered old thing with a plume he'd replaced with the ostrich feather. That way, if anyone noticed the feather falling, they'd link it to her. But in the act, the pin came loose from his own pocket, and the feather dropped in just the wrong place. She smiled faintly. People do forget the most telling little details when they're making grand plans. Mayhew took a sip of tea. We also found that Mr. Roper's role was exactly as you suspected. He was pressing Sims for repayment of a debt, but he had nothing to do with the murder. He left the village on Sunday morning before the service, intending to come back later in the week. The note he sent really was about payment by morning. He just didn't realize how short Sims's morning would be. Poor man, Miss Marple said quietly. Threats are bad enough when you expect to live through them, but worse still when they make you careless in your last hours. Mayhew set down his cup. I suppose you'll be modest about it. But the truth is, we might have gone round in circles for days without that little demonstration of yours in the church. Once I saw him make that movement behind Ivy, I knew exactly what you meant. She inclined her head in acknowledgement. It is easier to believe what one has seen with one's own eyes, Inspector, and Edwin was quite unable to keep from doing it. Habits do reveal the hand that wears them. By Tuesday, the village was already beginning its slow return to routine. The postman no longer paused to exchange theories at every gate. The vicar resumed his usual round of visits, though with a sermon planned for Sunday on the theme of truth in all things, which Mrs. Little had already declared she would find most edifying. Joel Noakes returned to his sweeping and polishing, though Miss Marple noticed he spent a little longer than usual on the porch step, as if guarding it against the memory of that black feather. Ivy Barlow called at the cottage late in the afternoon. She looked pale still, but her eyes were calmer. I wanted to thank you, Miss Marple, she said, clutching her shawl. If you hadn't, well, I don't know how I'd have proved I wasn't part of it. My dear, Miss Marple said, the truth was always there. It only needed to be given a little air and light. But you must also remember that trusting the wrong person can be just as dangerous as being suspected yourself. You have a kind nature, and that is a blessing. But do be careful to whom you lend it. Ivy nodded solemnly, and Miss Marple saw that she understood. That evening, as dusk settled over Little Bramble, Miss Marple sat with her knitting in her lap and allowed her mind to wander over the case one final time. It had been, in many ways, an ordinary village crime, rooted not in grand passions or deep conspiracies, but in the all-too-familiar soil of financial mismanagement, fear of exposure, and the quiet arrogance of thinking oneself clever enough to escape notice. She thought again of Edwin Blakely, agreeable in manner, pleasant to speak to, yet willing to shape the scene so another might take the blame. The plan had been neat in its way. The placement of Ivy, the feather as a diversion, the timing of the act to the cover of the hymn. But it had been fatally marred by one thing Edwin could not control. His own ingrained gesture, the leaning forward to rest a hand on the pew ahead. A habit so automatic, he did it without thought, even in the moment of murder. The memory of that morning, her handkerchief slipping into the aisle, Edwin's reflexive reach, Ivy's involuntary flinch, was as clear to her as the knitting in her lap. That was the moment the knot had begun to loosen, the pattern revealing itself for what it was. Outside, the last of the daylight faded, and the first star showed above the dark line of the yews in St. Mildred's churchyard. Somewhere in the distance, the faint chime of the hour drifted across the fields. Miss Marple set down her knitting and rose to draw the curtains, feeling the familiar quiet satisfaction that came when a puzzle had been answered and the pieces put away. Yet she knew, as she always did, that the village would not stay peaceful for long. In every tidy cottage, behind every bright garden gate, there were lives unfolding. Some with secrets still neatly folded away, others with small resentments beginning to stir. Sooner or later, human nature would find a way to trouble the surface again. For now, though, little Bramble was still, and Miss Marple, who understood better than most that stillness can hide as much as it reveals, settled into her chair with her tea and her knitting, prepared to enjoy it while it lasted. The days following Edwin Blakely's arrest settled into a peculiar calm, as if the village were catching its breath after a sudden fright. The frost still edged the hedgerows in the mornings, smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and the winter sun did its best to warm the cobblestones of the high street. Yet, beneath the ordinary sights and sounds, a subtle shift lingered. Little Bramble had been reminded, sharply, that even its most familiar faces could hide unwelcome truths. Miss Marple noticed it in small ways. The way Mrs. Little now paused before accepting gossip without question. The unusually polite tone with which George Blakely addressed Joel Noakes in the church porch. The gentle, almost protective way the vicar spoke to Ivy Barlow when she passed him in the lane. People had been jolted out of their easy assumptions, and for a time, at least, they would tread more carefully around one another. Inspector Mayhew came by midweek to bring her the final word. "The case is closed," he said, removing his gloves by her fire. "Edwin's been remanded to Melchester to await trial. He's admitted to the financial irregularities and to planning the murder, though he insists it was a last resort. Claims he never meant to involve Ivy. Said she was simply in the way and useful for appearances." Miss Marple poured his tea and regarded him over the rim of her cup. Appearances are often the only thing such people count upon. It never occurs to them that the smallest slip, dropping a feather, for instance, can unravel their neatest plans. Mayhew smiled faintly. That feather was the beginning of the end for him. We've had it confirmed. It was trimmed from a plume bought in Melchester 3 months ago. The shopkeeper remembered Edwin. He said the young man claimed it was for a church pageant. "A neat lie," Miss Marple said mildly. "One can dress a falsehood in Sunday clothes, but it remains a falsehood all the same." They spoke for a while longer about the upcoming trial and about Roper, who had since been released with a warning. The inspector left with a final, almost rueful comment. "If you ever tire of your knitting, Miss Marple, there's a desk at Melchester CID with your name on it." She laughed gently. "I dare say I'm more useful where I am, Inspector. People tell me things here they would never dream of telling a policeman." After he had gone, Miss Marple turned her thoughts to the villagers who had found themselves drawn into the affair. George Blakely, though not implicated, bore the weight of having been in the vestry with the victim moments before his death. His manner was brisker now, and he had taken to mending church railings in the afternoons. Perhaps, she thought, to quiet the whispers that still occasionally rose when he walked into a room. Ivy Barlow was another matter. The girl seemed quieter, more watchful. One evening, she appeared at Miss Marple's gate with a small pot of primroses, a shy thank you for her help. They sat together in the parlor, and slowly Ivy spoke of how Edwin had flattered her, made her feel noticed in a way few others had. "I didn't see what he was until it was too late," she admitted. "I thought he was kind." "My dear," Miss Marple said, "people often show us the part of themselves they wish us to see. It is not a crime to be taken in. It is only a pity when it costs us our trust. You will recover yours in time." By the weekend, life in Little Bramble had resumed its outward rhythm. The Saturday market bustled once more. The vicar's sermon drew a full congregation, curious to hear what he might say about honesty. Joel Noakes rang the bells with extra care, as though the tone could carry reassurance as well as summons. Miss Marple attended as she always did, slipping into her usual pew. She observed the small changes with interest. Ivy now sat with Mrs. Harkness instead of at the back, Edwin's absence leaving a faint gap in the village's social pattern, George keeping his head down during the hymns. And all the while, the organ played, its notes smooth, free from the cipher problem that had plagued it, as if Mr. Sims's final tuning had been a silent farewell to the work he loved. After the service, she lingered in the churchyard, where the low winter sun turned the yews almost black against the pale sky. Mrs. Little bustled over, her bonnet trembling in the breeze. "Well, Miss Marple, I don't mind telling you the whole thing has given me a turn. I shall look at people differently from now on, especially the polite ones." "That is wise," Miss Marple agreed. "But do remember, my dear, that most politeness is genuine. It is only when it hides something else that we must be careful." Mrs. Little nodded, half satisfied, and went on her way. As the churchyard emptied, Miss Marple found herself walking the path past the porch where the black feather had first caught her eye. She paused, almost hearing again the faint murmur of the congregation, the last notes of the hymn, the stillness that had masked the fatal act. It was not morbidness that held her there, but reflection. How quickly a moment could pass from innocence into tragedy, and how easily it could have remained unexplained if not for one or two tiny, telling details. Back at her cottage, she put the kettle on and took her knitting from the basket. The black feather lay in a small envelope in her work drawer, not as a morbid souvenir, but as a reminder. She did not collect trophies, but sometimes a tangible thing helped fix the memory of a case, like a pin in a map. She settled into her chair, the familiar click of the needles resuming their quiet rhythm. Outside, the lane was peaceful. The only sound was the occasional cartwheel on the cobbles, the call of a distant milkman. It struck her, as it often did after such affairs, that the village would soon forget the sharper edges of the event. Time would soften the story, turn it into something to be retold at tea tables on winter afternoons. The truth, how Edwin had planned and carried out his crime, how Ivy had been used as an unwitting shield, how Roper's arrival had been a coincidence, would remain clear only to a few. But Miss Marple did not mind. The satisfaction of seeing justice done lay not in the applause, but in the knowledge that the pattern had been set right again. For now, Little Bramble's pattern was as it should be. Threads smooth, colors balanced, and no loose ends to catch the eye. Still, she knew enough of human nature to be certain it would not remain so forever. Somewhere, quietly, another thread was already beginning to fray. And when it did, she would be here, tea in hand, needles in motion, ready to notice the small thing others overlooked. In the meantime, the fire burned warmly in the grate. The kettle steamed gently on the hob, and Miss Marple allowed herself the rare pleasure of thinking only of the present moment. The mystery of the black feather had been solved, its shadows lifted from the village, and peace, however temporary, had returned. A week after Edwin Blakely's arrest, the rhythm of Little Bramble had resumed in earnest. The clink of milk bottles in the early morning, the chatter of children in the schoolyard, the smell of baking from Mrs. Rudd's oven. Life flowed forward, carrying with it only faint ripples of the disturbance that had so recently unsettled the village. The King's Head Hotel in Melchester, once a vague, sinister point in the story, had returned to being simply a place where traveling salesmen took their tea. Roper had disappeared from local talk entirely, having left for another town under a cloud of his own making, though not one darkened by murder. And in St. Mildred's, the organ played with a fullness and steadiness it had not enjoyed in months. Mr. Sims's final tuning, ironically, had ensured its perfect tone. Miss Marple, for her part, noticed the subtle marks left by the affair. Ivy Barlow, though she smiled more easily now, had an air of greater caution about her. She seemed less inclined to speak hastily and more apt to measure her company. George Blakely kept much to himself, the lines around his mouth deeper, as if he bore a private regret for having shared the vestry with a man who would be dead moments later. Even Mrs. Little, though still an eager gardener of gossip, was slower to plant her rumors, testing the soil before scattering them. The vicar, perhaps, had been changed most visibly. His sermon the following Sunday was on the virtue of candor and the perils of concealing small faults. The greatest harm, he intoned, often begins in what we excuse as a little harmless bending of the truth. His voice was mild, but the eyes he turned on, the congregation seemed to rest a moment longer on the faces of those who had, in one way or another, stood close to the crime. On Tuesday afternoon, Miss Marple received a visitor, Joel Noakes, the sexton, who arrived at her cottage with a jar of his wife's quince jam and a certain stiffness of manner that suggested an errand undertaken with reluctance. "I wanted to say," he began, turning his cap in his hands, "that I reckon you saved the lot of us from a great deal of trouble. If it had gone the way Edwin planned, we'd have been pointing fingers at that poor girl forever. Not right, that." Miss Marple thanked him warmly. "You helped more than you think, Joel. Without your careful eye on that step, we might still be wondering whose foot had turned so sharply there." He seemed almost embarrassed by the praise. "Well, I mind the church, don't I? And the Lord knows the stones don't lie." After he had gone, she sat a while, thinking about the curious interplay of observation and chance. It was true that the scuff mark had been a piece of luck, but luck only became useful when it was seen and remembered at the right moment. In her experience, most people saw much less than they believed. By the end of the month, the murder of Mr. Sims had taken on the air of a story already slipping into the past. In the market, it was mentioned with a shake of the head, a sigh, perhaps a remark about how you never really know about people. There was no shortage of fresh talk to occupy the village. Mrs. Harkness's niece had become engaged to a bank clerk in Crowthorne, and Mr. Hale's prize roses had been nipped by an unexpected frost. Miss Marple, however, allowed herself one last quiet review of the affair before letting it rest entirely. The image of the black feather on the church step returned to her mind often, not for its drama, but for its ordinariness. It had been, to most, just a bit of fluff to be swept away. To her, it had been the first thread of a tapestry she had not yet seen, but already suspected. In her work basket, the feather remained, tucked into its envelope. She had no sentimental attachment to it. Rather, it was like a pressed flower in a book, a reminder of a moment when something small had led to something large. She thought, as she sometimes did, of all the countless tiny signs people left behind in their daily lives, each one a potential clue to a larger truth. The winter days lengthened, bringing a softness to the air, and the first shy snowdrops appeared at the edges of the churchyard. On one such morning, Miss Marple walked the familiar path past the lych gate. pausing to greet Joel, who was trimming the ewes. She glanced at the worn steps where the feather had lain, the stone now bare and dry. Nothing lingered there now. No sign of the morning when the village's peace had been broken, no hint of the careful act that had taken place in the stillness between him and prayer. And yet, Miss Marple knew that the truth of it remained, lodged in the memories of those who had been there, even if time and talk would soften its edges. She stood a moment longer, then turned for home, her thoughts moving ahead to the tasks of the day. Writing a letter to her nephew Raymond, preparing a seed list for the spring planting, mending a small tear in her good gloves. These too were the small things that shaped the pattern of life, and they deserved their place. Back in her cottage, she set water to boil for tea and settled into her armchair. The fire was warm, the room tidy, the world outside quiet enough to make the ticking of the clock seem companionable. She took up her knitting, the familiar rhythm of the needles as steady as her own thoughts. It pleased her to think that the village had, for now, returned to its comfortable ways. There would be other disturbances in time, there always were. But for the moment, all was well. The peace was genuine, even if it was only as lasting as the next small thing to go wrong. Her eyes drifted to the window, where the pale sun caught on the frost still clinging to the garden wall. It reminded her, faintly, of that first Sunday morning. The same stillness, the same clarity of light, though without the shadow that had fallen before. Miss Marple smiled to herself and counted the stitches on her needle. Whatever might come next, she would be ready. Not because she sought out trouble, but because trouble, in her experience, had a way of arriving uninvited. And when it did, it would bring with it the same pattern it always had. A quiet disruption, a scattering of small clues, and the slow but certain unraveling of a truth that thought itself well hidden. She would, as ever, notice the little things, gather them up, and see where they led. But for today, there was only the fire, the knitting, and the soft chime of the hour. Little Bramble was at peace, and so was she. The trial at Melchester was over quickly. Edwin Blakely, faced with the weight of his own admissions, the evidence of the feather, and the quiet precision of Miss Marple's testimony, had little ground to stand on. He was found guilty of murder, the verdict delivered in the same matter-of-fact tone with which the clerk had read the charges. There had been no dramatic outbursts, no appeals to sentiment, only the inevitability of justice catching up with a man who had mistaken his own cleverness for infallibility. News of the conviction reached Little Bramble by the mid-morning post. By midday, every household knew, and the small groups that gathered in the market spoke of it with that mixture of finality and faint relief reserved for matters that have been settled at last. The village, it seemed, was eager to draw a line under the whole business. Miss Marple, however, was not quite ready to close her own ledger. For her, the matter of Edwin's guilt was clear, but the case itself had been a lesson worth carrying forward, not in the mechanics of murder, but in the deeper currents of human behavior. She reflected on how swiftly gossip had latched onto Ivy Barlow, how easily the obvious seat in the pew had turned suspicion toward the wrong person, and how, in the quiet moments, people had revealed more about themselves than they ever intended. That afternoon, Ivy came to call. Her manner was steadier now, her eyes clearer than they had been since that terrible Sunday. "I don't know how to thank you," she said simply. "You believed me when I wasn't sure anyone else did." Miss Marple gave her a kind smile. "My dear, I believed what I saw. And what I saw was a frightened young woman sitting in the wrong place at the wrong time. Not a murderer. The rest was only a matter of making the truth fit together properly." Ivy hesitated. "Will people Forget? In time, Miss Marple replied. But what matters most is that you remember. Not the fear, but the lesson. Trust is a fine thing, but it ought to be given to those who have earned it. Later, as Miss Marple walked to the church for evensong, she found herself pausing at the porch. The winter sun was low, its light catching the worn steps where the black feather had once lain. It seemed strange that such a small thing, a scrap of plume barely worth noticing, had been the thread that, once pulled, had unraveled the entire tangle. Inside, the organ's voice was rich and full, the result of Mr. Sims's final care. The pews were in their usual order. The congregation settled into familiar seats, the vicar's voice carrying its gentle rhythm through the nave. Everything appeared just as it always had. Yet Miss Marple knew the memory of that Sunday would linger in the walls for years to come. As the last hymn faded and the congregation filed out into the fading light, Joel Noakes paused to tip his cap. "Glad to see it all put right, Miss Marple," he said. "Makes a man think how quick trouble can creep in." She nodded, and how quickly it can be put out again if one notices the little things. Back in her cottage, she placed the black feather, still sealed in its envelope, into the drawer where she kept a few mementos from past cases. Not trophies, never that, but quiet reminders of what small details can do when looked at with the right eyes. She poured herself a cup of tea, the fire warm in the grate, her knitting waiting in its basket. Outside, the first stars were beginning to prick the evening sky, and the village, for now, was at peace. Miss Marple took up her needles, the soft click of them keeping time with the steady beat of the clock. There would be other cases, other puzzles, other human failings to untangle. But until they came, she was content to let Little Bramble rest in its hard-won tranquility. For in her experience, peace was always temporary, but knowing how to restore it was a skill she would never lose.